Hello everyone, this is Peter Svidler with the recap of round 12 of the Candidates Tournament in Berlin. And for the first time in what feels like forever, this video will not feature a game by Vladimir Kramnik. It will instead be a hugely relevant game in the context of the standings in the tournament, which features on the black side the player who led the tournament up to that point. What feels like for the entire duration of the event, and definitely since round 4, Karjakin-Caruana playing with the black pieces against Sergei Karjakin. Before the round started, these players were separated by a full point, with Shahryar Mamedyarov in clear second, and Fabiano needed to make sure that he does not lose this game to enter the final rest day, which will be tomorrow, the 25th of March, with his lead likely preserved and excellent chances of qualifying for the match against Magnus Carlsen later this year. Sergei Karjakin, on the other hand, had a fantastic second half of the tournament. He started by losing 2 games with white in the early parts of the tournament, including a game in round 1 and then a game in round 4 against Levon Aronian. And it seemed like his tournament was not really going anywhere near according to plan. But then he won what looked like a completely drawn endgame against Wesley So in round 7. And from that moment on, it felt like he was completely sort of replaced or rejuvenated and started playing his absolute best chess. Won another 2 games in the next 4 rounds, and from -2 and no serious chances in the tournament, he entered round 12 and the game against the tournament leader on +1 and within striking distance of the lead. Therefore, this game assumed tremendous importance for the final outcome of the tournament. Karjakin, more than anyone in this field, is a 1e4 player, and this is what he does against Fabi. E5, knight f3, knight f6. Fabiano is now very much a Petrov player. And Karjakin goes for 5 knight c3, which is really the line that lessened the popularity of the Petrov. Once many people started playing this with white, the Petrov became less of an attractive option for the black players, it feels, because you have to defend unpleasant, somewhat boring positions with no winning chances, apologies. And there was definitely a shift from more or less everyone playing the Petrov at some point, or at least very many people, to people switching to Berlin as their solid opening of choice. But now Fabiano is using the Petrov again, and he's been largely untroubled in this tournament. Mainly, I think, because people were playing Queen e2 against him, and knight c3, of course, is a more challenging move than Queen e2. Knight takes, d takes, knight c6, bishop e3, bishop e7, queen d2. There are different move orders available here for both white and black, but this is by far the main setup in these positions. And originally, people used to castle kingside here and go something like knight e5, and these positions do become potentially very sharp. But I think by this point, the main plan that most people go for in these positions is to play bishop e6. After white castles queenside, you play queen d7, and you hope to eventually castle queenside. And this greatly diminishes, obviously, any potential for the pawn storms with opposite color castles. White's plans in these positions used to consist of trying to play knight g5 in a good addition, force black to give up the e7 bishop for the knight, and then try to play with the 2 bishops against the bishop and knight. And I myself won a few nice games with white in those positions, but they tend to be very solid. And also, even forcing black to take is not always very easy, because bishop f5 often will be a very decent reply to knight g5. And in this position, white by this point made pretty much every single legal move known to man. Obviously b3, I don't know why I said obviously, but b3 is a very natural way of playing these positions, preparing maybe the square on b2 for the king, and generally stopping any ideas of bishop takes a2, which in some rare cases could be a move that black can make. There's also, of course, king b1. This is a lot more obvious than b3. I should have started with that. And Karjakin goes for a3, which is a reasonably rare move compared to the other two. It has similar ideas. You stabilize your situation on the queen side, and there will be some positions in this game where the fact that queen d7, a4 after the knight on c6 gets traded doesn't attack anything on the queen side is a useful little detail. But these are all, very, very minute changes, and it's not obvious, I think, to anyone here exactly why a3 is stronger than king b1, at least at first glance. Fabi played h6. It's also possible to play a6. It has been played by Yuri Kuzubov very recently, but these things generally just flow into each other. That game continued a6, bishop e2, h6. Something similar could have happened in the game we are discussing if after h6 Sergei would play bishop e2. Instead of that, Sergei played knight d4. Also notably, this position happened in a practical game played by Fabiano's second in Berlin, Rustam Kasemjanov. But Rustam was playing white in that game, and he played king b1 here, to which black replied by a very curious looking move, rook g8, which is basically black preparing for knight d4, knight takes d4, and let's say bishop takes d4, by protecting the pawn on g7 in advance. And that game, after bishop d3 long castles, was eventually drawn. Instead of all this, Sergei plays knight d4 straight away. Black, of course, takes, because allowing knight takes e6 is not really all that great. Bishop takes d4, and Fabi plays rook g8 here. You can make an argument for castling, but once again, in particular once you played h7, h6, a position like this is about as close to a dream scenario for white as it's possible to get, because white's plan is very straightforward. You start pushing your pawns on the king side, and there will be some initiative available to you, although objectively you have to assume that black is not really doing all that horribly here. Rook g8 is a safer move because, once again, you're preparing to eventually castle queenside, where the king should generally be feeling a lot safer than on g8. Bishop e2. And during the live broadcast, I was making an argument for a quiet move like a6, just to make sure that nothing is hanging, and then you castle queenside next move. And then white probably does something like c4, you castle long, queen c3, the pawn is hanging, so I suspect you should protect it. And we get some kind of a very slow position like this, where white has a distinctive spatial advantage. These pieces don't really make very much sense, and currently it's not very easy for black to even start threatening to trade stuff along the e-file. But eventually, after something like king b8, followed by, for instance, bishop h3 or maybe bishop f5 and then bishop f8, you free up enough squares on the e-file to start suggesting that pieces should start coming off. And black's position obviously has no weaknesses and is extremely solid. And I feel that this is really not that bad for black. But also going for this is very, very cheerless. And after thinking for a while here, Fabiano chooses to play c5, bishop e3, and d5. This is also very topical. Hoi Fine, for instance, played this type of a setup on 2 consecutive years in Vaik and did perfectly fine. And Sergei gained some space on the king side, f4, castle long, and bishop f3. This is very critical because black would very much like to transfer the bishop from e6 to e4, and by putting immediate pressure on the d5 pawn, perhaps hinting that in some positions you might even want to play f5, destruct this bishop, and then pick up on d5, you put the maximum amount of pressure on black immediately. And during the live broadcast, I immediately made the case for bishop g4 being the main move in this position, because I felt that taking the bishops off the board would benefit black greatly, and if white somewhat naively wins a pawn here by taking on d5 and taking on d5 again, my feeling was that this position is just not better for white at all. The rook will go to either f5 or h5. These are all very, very weak. And even if, let's say, simply the rooks come off and nothing else happens, then all the bishop endgames will be completely equal. But there are 2 issues with the move bishop g4. First of all, as I figured out after checking this position with the computer after the game finished, even something like queen f2 takes is not completely equal for black, because these pawns are slightly somewhat weak. And if you play something like queen c6, rook he1, bishop f6, bishop f2, black is not in time to play rook e8 here, because white will obviously take, and one of the central pawns just gets lost. Therefore, black has to make some kind of an awkward move like rook d7, and after g4, white definitely retains some pressure, although black probably should hold this position, but he's not going to be enjoying it very much. This is issue one. And the second one is what happened in the game. After bishop g4, Sergei, without too much hesitation, took on d5 and sacrificed the exchange on d1. And this position remains reasonably finely balanced, but immediately during the live show, we were saying with Jan that despite the objective evaluation of this, it's obviously and quite clearly a lot simpler to play with white than it is with black. And this became very readily apparent in the game, because Fabi, who generally understands quite well where the pieces belong, started making very uncharacteristic poor decisions. Queen c7 is a logical move, pinning the bishop. c4 is also very, very natural, even if computer suggests that starting with something like queen f2 or queen e2 may have been stronger. But you want to cement the position of the bishop on d5. It's a very, very obvious and natural thing to do in this position. Rook g8 is also very natural. And here Sergei played queen f2, unpinning the bishop, putting some pressure on the c5 pawn, which makes it a lot harder for black to play bishop f6 for the time being. And this is the first turning point of the game where, in particular, if you compare it with what Fabi got in the game, the move he should have made, it did not occur to me during the live broadcast, it did not occur to Jan. But once you see it, once again, obviously the computer pointed it out to us, you immediately realize why it is good and strong and why this has to be played. Black had to play f5 here, I feel. Black is not losing, or maybe even not necessarily all that much worse if he doesn't. But this just makes a lot of sense, because black wants to put the bishop on f6 eventually. And the bishop on f6 needs to be secure from g4, g5 ideas, which you will see later in the game. And if white goes something like rook d3, king b8, rook b3, b6, you get a very similar position to what we got in the game, but the bishop will be on f6. It will be impossible to challenge this piece. And it's not very clear what white can do about it, apart from some kind of an attempt to develop a mating attack. But black should generally hold positions like this quite comfortably, because he always will have decent counterplay, and the rook on b5 might get somewhat stuck even in some cases. I tried clicking through, and white can generate some threats, but black is reasonably comfortably able to meet them in most cases here. And f5 bishop takes e6, which does pick up the pawn on f5, is not very threatening, because if you take on d8 here, queen d8, bishop f5, bishop f6, the black pieces come out of the corner. The bishop will probably end up on d4, because you cannot take on c5. You're just immediately... this is a type of position where the number of pawns doesn't matter very much. What matters is piece activity. And suddenly black's pieces are a lot more active than white pieces, and for instance, this position already is much better for black. And all this makes it, I think, reasonably obvious why f5 is such a great idea, because the biggest issue facing black in the position in the game here is that he has pieces which don't really have enough living space between them, and they are badly in need of comfortable squares on the board. Fabi made a move which is still okay, but shows that maybe he doesn't really see the most optimal setup for his pieces. He played b6, and Sergei immediately played g4. So now f5 will no longer be available. Fabi played bishop f6. And here Sergei made the most obvious move in the position, which is king b1. You want to be sure of your king safety. You want to, in some cases, to have the c1 square for the bishop. But this would allow immediate equality if Fabi seized his chance. I wanted to see if maybe playing something less obvious would still give white some advantage, so I tried queen f3, which I think is the second most natural move in the position. But after queen e7, you have to go rook e1. Nothing else really makes any sense. And here black can play queen c7, recreating the threat of bishop d4, and the computer insists that black is completely fine. Or if you want to go for outlandish stuff, the computer actually suggested queen d6, bishop f7, rook e7, queen a8, king c7, queen takes a7, and king c8 is a complete draw, because despite giving up the a7 pawn with check, black just has enough counterplay. And after queen a6, let's say king c7, you do not have time to play bishop d5 due to rook d8, and once again the best white has here is this perpetual. This is obviously not how human beings play, but I just wanted to point out once again, I collect, so to speak, these weird computer suggestions of how to make a draw in a way that wouldn't occur to a human player ever. Sergei, as I mentioned, played king b1, which is a very reasonable idea. You want the king on safe squares here. And this is, I think, the moment where the game went off the rails for Fabiano. He made the move rook d7, which is a very, very indifferent square for this rook in all cases. And it also actually gets in the way of your own counterplay here. It shouldn't be on d7 in any situation, it feels to me. And also time is sort of running out. White is about to get completely established. The way to equalize here was to play queen e7. If bishop c1, black goes queen e2, and after queen g1, you do have to find a somewhat inhuman looking bishop d4, or you can start with rook takes d5 actually. This may be slightly more understandable. cd, bishop d4, queen h1, queen takes g4. And after d6 you go king b8. And it looks incredibly scary at first, but then you realize that the bishop on c1 is now very, very passive. Queen c6 is very adequately met by rook c8, and the queen gets driven back. And the pawn on d6 is, very likely to be rounded up and collected if white is not fast enough. So this position is actually reasonably easily holdable for black. I'm not saying this is easy to find, but queen e7, I think, should be played, and the question has to be passed to white. What do you want to do in this position? I suspect Sergei was planning to play rook d3 and not bishop c1 here, because allowing queen e2 looks weird. And in this position, black has a tactical shot b6, b5, which you need to see. But it's also very, very logical, because for this very short period of time, the white situation in the center is not completely solidified. C takes b5 obviously runs into, well, rook takes d5 is strong and c4 is even stronger, winning material, because eventually the bishop on e3 will fall. Bishop takes c5 allows queen e1 check, and black is immediately very comfortable. As usual in these positions, basically black badly wants to trade queens, and once the queens do come off, his situation improves dramatically. And if white starts with king a2, you go b takes c4, bishop takes c5, and in this position, once again, you can play queen e1, you can play queen e2. It leads to very similar positions. White takes, you take, white takes, you take, white takes. And here the simplest way is to protect the a7 pawn by playing something like king b8. And then your plan is to reactivate this bishop via d8, b6. And this is a very understandable, I think, for a human player, very understandable idea that it looks slightly scary. Maybe even this endgame looks slightly scary, but frankly, compared to the game position, I think most people would take this in a heartbeat, because once you shake the bishops from these two squares, the rook on the e-file will actually have squares to aim for, and black immediately has a decent amount of counterplay, and counterplay is what he badly needed. The move in the game is so awkward that after rook d7, rook d3, it is already very, very difficult to even figure out where that counterplay will be coming from. And the move g5 that Fabiano made here, I think makes his position in practical terms almost indefensible, because now he will also have to deal with the weaknesses on the king side. He could still play rook d7, queen f3, king b8, but here white can continue improving by playing something like king a2, and black really has very, very few moves to even try making. Or white can go for the immediate g4, g5, and it seems like this allows an immediate draw after takes, rook e3, rook e3, rook e3, queen e3 and queen e5. But as a matter of fact, of course, white doesn't trade queens. He goes queen b3, and this is still an incredibly dangerous position for black. I would go as far as to say that it's probably lost. It's a lot closer to being lost than it is to a draw, because of how weak this king is and how safe the white king will be after, let's say, king a2 followed by c2, c3. But as I mentioned, g5 is probably the point of no return, because now white doesn't have to react to it, and black will find it incredibly difficult to even stay in the game, because g5 is also a weakness white can exploit. Sergei played king a2. It's probably still advisable to play here, play king b8 here, and I kept on making the point during the live broadcast that, to my eyes, it feels that king b8 followed by something like a6 and king a7 is a very required improvement of the black position to at least try and make your king somewhat safe. But with the king side looking the way it looks right now, it's probably already too late for that, because the pawn on h6 is weak. White can go for all kinds of plans like this, and it really doesn't feel anymore that black can actually hold all of his combined weaknesses together. Instead of that, Fabi played another very awkward move, rook e7, which really makes his position sort of unplayable in practical terms, because none of these pieces really goes anywhere at all. Sergei played queen f3, king d8, bishop d2, showing just how unhurried he is. And after king c8, he thought for a while and came up with the idea that more or less crushes the black position. He played queen f1. It's not the only move that is very strong here, but I liked this approach very much, and Jan suggested it on the live broadcast as well. Queen f1, stepping away for a bit and creating an almost unparryable threat of rook h3. And from that moment on, black more or less completely collapsed, but I have a feeling that his position is really already completely indefensible. Fabi played rook d6, hoping to maybe move the bishop away and protect the h6 pawn somehow. Rook h3 is actually still completely winning even here. But what Sergei did is just as strong, or maybe even stronger. He took on g5 simply, bishop takes, takes, queen f5 check, rook d7, and queen takes g5. And now, combining this with all the problems of previous moves are still in place. The king is horrible. There is no coordination between the rooks. But to go with all that, white also now simply threatens to push the h-pawn down the board. And queen takes h2, loses on the spot to queen g8 check, rook d8, and now bishop e6 check just wins immediately. And of course, if you play king c7 after queen a8, you're not going to be enjoying this very much either. Fabi played queen e5, to which Sergei replied queen h6. Objectively, this was maybe a position in which black could prolong his suffering by playing f6, at least stopping the pawn from reaching g5 immediately. But objectively speaking, this position is not going to be saved. White just has too much of an advantage here. The h-pawn continues pushing, and white can always combine it with some threats against the black king. It was probably somewhat stronger than what Fabi did, but the result of the game from, let's say, this position was never really in doubt. Fabi played king d8 again, and now after g5, even the pawn on f7 is fixed to a very poor spot. And yeah, white just wins very, very comfortably. Queen d6, check, rook e8, queen h4 check, creating an idea of g6 check, queen g6, queen g4, creating a threat of queen takes d7 followed by bishop takes f7, rook e5, a smart little trap. Bishop e4, which was a different threat there, is now reasonably well met by queen e6, and there is no bishop f5. And if you take on d7 in this position, bishop e4 is met by queen d6, and bishop takes f7 is met by queen takes d3. But there is absolutely no reason for white to hurry with any of this. Sergei played h4, and black's problems remain absolutely the same. All these things still are threats, and you still have to watch for them. Fabi played king e7. Here I was making an argument for rook f3, which is completely winning. But the move that Sergei played, which is rook d2, doesn't really spoil anything at all. White is now threatening rook f2 without even allowing black to take on c2 anywhere. And black is basically just completely helpless because he cannot really improve the coordination of his pieces. Fabi played b5, and in this position Sergei did a tidy little bit of calculation and finally went for a forcing operation which wins on the spot. He played bishop takes f7, queen f5 is the only move, and here he took on d7, king takes, queen takes f5, rook f5, g6, king f7 strictly only move, c takes b5. Black does win the h4 pawn, but this doesn't matter at all because white goes c4, rook takes h4. And here he demonstrated the easiest and the most effective way of winning this position, a4. The pawn just gets to a6. The only way to stop a very simple plan of playing a6 and then b6 is to play king c7 here. And here Sergei played king b3, and Fabi just resigned because there's absolutely no help for black against a very, very simple plan of driving the king to f3, getting the rook away from the fourth, and then going to f6. And the g-pawn will just promote eventually because the king, the black king cannot join the defense due to the constant threat of b6 and a7. A very, very efficient technical win by Sergei Karjakin, who, when faced with arguably one of the most solid openings in the world, found a way to get a little bit of something out of the opening, even though it didn't look like very much. And given half a chance, he went for the sharpest possible option, bishop takes d5. It's not a difficult move to make, but you still have to make it, considering that you're slightly better after queen f2 anyway. And the moment Fabi started making small mistakes, they were ruthlessly and very, very efficiently exploited by Sergei. His victory in this game means that with 2 rounds to go, Sergei Karjakin and Caruana are tied on 7 out of 12, with 3 people on +1 trailing them by half a point. Ding Liren beat Shahryar Mamedyarov in a second decisive game of the round, catching him up, and Alexander Grishuk is also on +1. So there's a tie for first, and then there are 3 people tied for third, half a point behind them. So the entire tournament is now blown wide open. There are all kinds of tiebreak permutations which are, I think, unnecessary for this video, but from what we could understand, you have to say that Sergei Karjakin is now a slight favorite to win the candidates tournament because of the fact that the tiebreaks, if we understand it correctly, go in this order: a direct encounter, and Sergei has decent results against people who he is likely to tie with. Then the number of wins, and Sergei is currently the only player in the tournament who won 4 games. And only then the Zonenberg-Berger, which we did not attempt to calculate because it's unlikely that we'll get to the Zonenberg-Berger stage. And because of his good head-to-head score against, for instance, against Caruana, he won his micro match against Caruana, and also due to the fact that he is the player with the highest number of wins in the entire tournament. Sergei now effectively is leading the tournament with 2 rounds to go. But there is a lot of very, very exciting pairings in those 2 rounds, so please make sure to stay tuned and watch our coverage, which resumes on Monday, 3 p.m. Central European Time. Same place, same time. Don't miss out. I hope you enjoyed this video. This has been Peter Svidler for Chess24.